Well, I've just hit noon Eastern. Good morning to everybody, not Eastern, I guess, across the country. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So I am Brian Klontz, president of Charitable Solutions. I have my colleagues, partners on the phone, Gary Snerson and Ryan Raffin, who will be doing by far the meat of the presentation. I'll maybe make snarky comments as we go along, but I'll also be more importantly manning the Q&A. Gary very appropriately corrected me. I said Gary had been with us about 8 years-ish, and he said actually it's been 11 years, so that's how poor I am on guessing time. And Ryan is, I think, coming up on 10 years, so been working with us for a long time. So appreciate all that service and obviously the content you're going to deliver today. Quick housekeeping. So if anybody can put their questions, actually, if you go back, Ryan, if you don't mind, just questions and answers in the Q&A side versus the chat. It's just much easier for us to scrape that and easier to reply. We are not sending out the slides as I think everybody knows from the past, but we do send out, of course, the full recording. We do have, I think, 45 or 46 of those now. So many, we had to build a YouTube landing page for that now, which is now great. So we're able to have a lot more capacity there. And this will be posted next week with all the Q&A from today and from Tuesday. So we're going to be talking about donating commercial real estate, trends, tricks, traps, and travel. And again, Gary and Ryan will be taking us through that. We do a lot in this space, and hopefully their expertise will be able to help walk through all of these 4 T's that we sort of highlight here. So about us, so maybe now next slide, Ryan. So founded the firm in January 15th, 2003. I still use this 20th anniversary logo because we paid a lot for it, even though we're now in the 21st year, but continuing to use that. And since day one, our mission has been to help make charitable gifts happen that otherwise wouldn't. We have a team of 27 people. Now, Gary and Ryan are part of our sort of legal team, processing these types of gifts, but other types of projects as well. And our primary area, I'll sort of whip through a couple of these, is sort of the Emergency Assistance Fund area. That's separate charity entirely, but the Emergency Assistance Foundation I set up about 12, 13 years ago. Again, bad on my estimate, so could have been longer, I don't know. But we have about 150 staff on that side. We do global disaster relief and personal hardship grants. And you can sort of see the activity there. We actually have 2 or 3 very large nonprofit hospital systems that use that as well, but it's primarily large multinational organizations. I think our average employee size is maybe 40,000, 35,000 employees. So they tend to be very large, but work sort of in that space as an aggregator and risk manager for these types of grants. So it's quite complex. Then we do these types of things, CE, for advisors, board staff, nonprofit, and donors. I think I was out maybe 30 days over the spring doing these. Ryan does speeches, Gary does speeches, Paul on our team is doing a lot of speeches as well. So primarily invited in either for estate planning councils or working with community foundation clients that we have too. Then we do charitable appraisals. And so our tagline is, if you can give it to charity, we can appraise it. I think I've done 2, 3 actually life insurance appraisals this morning and 1 crypto appraisal. So I do those particular interests, but we have 2 other appraisers doing business interests. And then we have 1 for tangible property and 1 for precious metals. So again, anything that's donated to charity during life or through life income or through estates that otherwise need appraisals, we are qualified appraisals only in the charitable space. Gift annuities, sort of getting back to helping make charitable gifts happen that otherwise wouldn't. I'll sort of start with the National Gift Annuity Foundation there, sort of bottom left. Many of you may know we are licensed in all 50 states. This entity has now existed for over 20 years. And we have coming up on 1,000 contracts. I need to update this, but on 1,000 contracts and about 95 million or so in total assets. Most importantly, none of the liquid funds upon termination, the residuum, stays with us. So 100% is granted out to the charity or charities that the donor is trying to make the gift to. So we have often a charity that might say, hey, we're a huge charity, but we don't want to, understandably, get our license in California or New York or even crazier, Hawaii. We're in all 50 states, so they would refer those over. Or there are organizations that don't wish to continue issuing gift annuities but they want to have that as part of their menu, or it's for real estate or perhaps S corp or crypto or some other kind of complex gift, again, like commercial real estate as an example. Or it may be a very large one relative to their pool, or they just don't want to, or they're sort of not issuing gift annuities at all. And rather than saying no to a good donor with a good asset wanting to do good things, they would refer that over. So bottom line is we're just a national aggregator for these types of gift annuities. Top middle there, also did a thing today, another project around gift annuity risk audits. And so we've done this since day one from the firm. Do typically 2 to 3 of these a month, so not a huge number, but basically we have 2 actuaries. We were able to do full stress testing and analysis of gift annuity pools, cash flow modeling, identifying risk, mitigating risk, and in particular for very large concentrated risks within the pool, either as new ones coming in as prospective gift annuities. We did one that was $52 million on one person. That was not us, that was another client charity that we work with. So how you actually mitigate risk for that as an example. Other charities I know have one, I think University in the Northeast might be one that's 80 or 85 million on one person. So some of these are coming in really, really big. At another case we worked on with a community foundation, it was 32 million for 2 daughters as a testamentary CGA. So the point is, to the extent that they're very large ones, we look whether reinsurance makes sense, other mitigation strategies, direct design and placement of that reinsurance, if that makes sense as well. And then finally, what we're talking about today, most importantly, are non-cash assets. So we do this sort of in 2 ways. One is we have a national donor advised fund. We actually have 2. One is in corporate form, one is in trust form. And we only take in illiquid or complex gifts. So similar to the National Gift Annuity Foundation, if I were smart, I would have named it the National Non-Cash Foundation. Don't know why I didn't do that. But DECMI is Greek for to graciously receive. And so we thought that was clever until we've had to pronounce it, spell it, and explain it 18,000 times over the last 21 years. More true than not, by the way. So that is a national donor advised fund where donors are trying to make gifts to their favorite charities, charity, or multiple ones. By the way, back on gift annuities, sometimes we'll have a donor come in and say, hey, I love this one charity and they issue gift annuities and everything's great, but I've got 4 others that I'm also interested in that don't issue. So we can do the one gift annuity and then we just split it on the back end. Same thing with non-cash assets. So every once in a while we'll have a charity or donor come in, want to have multiple charitable beneficiaries, but from the one asset. Or going to multiple, one to an advised fund, one to the church as an example. So the point is that we have our team, about 95% of our work are actually receiving the gifts. We're on chain of title, due diligence, do everything through the process. We call that the sausage making component. And then just like the National Gift Annuity Foundation, we never manage anything once it's liquid. So once it's liquid, 30 days later, it's being granted out based on a standing grant recommendation, best practice donor advised fund, etc., to the charity or charities they were trying to give to. There are some situations where a donor might want to invest uniquely in a concentrated position or in real estate, commercial real estate, or into private stock that we are able to explore. That doesn't work every time. The point there is that we can receive cash in and then do a direct investment into that concentrated or illiquid position. So that's about 1/3 of our assets now are in those types of investments, which is kind of interesting. We have roughly $2 billion in overall assets. Weirdly, we would have 0 if everything worked perfectly. In theory, it would come in, it would sell, it would go out. So we are not about sort of asset growth at all in terms of our mission. It's all about, again, capturing these gifts. Otherwise, that would not have happened. Also brag on Gary and Ryan. I think last year our average turn time for private business gifts was about 2 to 3 days from the initial phone call, if we got due diligence documents then. And so not 3 days and then we get the due diligence documents. But after we have that initial phone call, due diligence documents, we had a series of these. I think we completed literally same day. So Russ Willis on our team was able to make that happen. The point is we move fast. Even on real estate gifts, if they're saying we want to get this done as quickly as we can and we get those due diligence documents, averaging about 5 to 7 days or so. So some a little bit sooner, some a little bit later, but you get the point. This is not a 2 to 3 month sort of runway. So the next, and by the way, the average fee was about 1.2% overall. So then that's captured at the time of the actual grant. So that 1.2% is held back for operating everything else. And then roughly 99 cents on the dollar then is granted out. So again, that was our average fee. So then quickly, this was our activity for last year. So again, this is just Decamine itself, Decamine Foundation and Asset Trust for 2023. You can see there are 161 donations, so not a ton, about one every day-ish, every kind of other day. But it was about 1.1 billion. 100% of those were declined, or we would not have received the referral. So 1.1 billion received through Decamine. All of those again were declined before the referral, and that averages about 6.8 million per donation. So these tend to be large. Ryan did a great job of highlighting what we're talking about today is real estate. 41 real estate transactions. All these are, of course, completed. You can see they're roughly $2 million per real estate transaction. Then we have business interest that's been consistently about 90% of everything we do every year. And you can see there are almost 950 million just in business interest. You see the breakdown. I will say that many, in fact, of the LP interest or LLC interests perhaps might be invested in commercial real estate. So that's a whole other conversation, but those otherwise would be captured there. So in terms of the real estate activity, wild guess here, that might be closer to 60 to 70 that we receive. So about one or two a week. I think we've done two so far this week already. But the point is that a lot sort of in that real estate space. Cryptocurrency, everybody wants to talk about it. That's about 1% consistently the last 2 or 3 years until this year. So I think we're around 30, 35 million we received in crypto so far, at least of crypto itself or within the ecosystem. So it might be a managed crypto LP interest, et cetera. So the point is that might change a bit. And cash here, you might say, wow, that's a ton of cash. The only reason we're receiving cash are to pay expenses on holding period costs, but by far, my guess here is probably 55 million of this was cash coming from the donor or from other donor advised funds to do these direct investments into concentrated real estate or private business interests. So with that, we'll jump to the agenda. We'll let Ryan sort of take over here and talk about the content for the day. So thanks, Ryan.
Great. Thanks, Brian. And thanks everyone for tuning in. Just a quick agenda here because we do have a lot of content to get through, although there's not a lot of items on the agenda. First, just describing what we're talking about when we say commercial real estate. And then Gary is going to talk about recent trends in the commercial real estate market and how that's reflected with donations. Then donation considerations, which will really be the bulk of the presentation. And then finally, a short discussion of some gift planning options. So jumping right in, because on Tuesday, we did not have a lot of time to get through everything. Types of commercial real estate, so when a donor says they've got commercial real estate, what do they mean? First, you've got sort of your classic retail real estate, and that can mean a couple different things on its own. Either you can have a single building, single tenant parcel, think like, a standalone restaurant or a bank, auto repair shop, sort of the out parcel in a shopping center. But on the flip side, then you have those multi-tenant things like a shopping center, and that can range from two retail space building to something much larger like a mall. So retail is a big part of this mix. We also get a lot of office space inquiries, including things like doctors' offices, which are can be quite complicated. So you get office space donations as well. And then, of course, there's mixed use. Usually that does mean retail and office, but we do also see inquiries of retail and multifamily, which means typically apartments. Sometimes I suppose it would be condos, but I don't think, condos are going to be separately deeded, so that wouldn't really work. So, when you think about mixed use, retail and office, sometimes retail and apartments, and then you get your kind of bulkier commercial real estate, things like warehouses and industrial real estate, which is usually some kind of manufacturing. So typically falling into those 5 categories. We're not talking about anything to do with farmland or ag here. That would be a presentation unto itself. And really there are a lot of unique considerations for ag that don't really come up with commercial real estate. So That's best discussed separately, so maybe a future webinar there. What are the characteristics of commercial real estate? With commercial real estate, you're almost always going to have tenants in the mix. And unlike with residential real estate, that's usually a good thing for reasons that I'm going to go into on this slide, and we will continue to go into throughout the presentation. Commercial real estate tends to be quite a bit larger than residential on average. Some of these buildings can be tens of thousands of square feet. If we're talking about large warehouse space, large industrial space, office tower, you're considerably larger, like an order of magnitude larger than what you would see even with big residential real estate. And as a result, they tend to be costly to maintain. This is a big, big factor with commercial real estate. Expensive to insure, expensive to pay utilities on. They are just significant burdens in terms of the carrying costs. And also in terms of the management, which is why you really do need often an on-site manager. And that's more common than not, I would say, with commercial real estate, unless it is something that is very small, like that single tenant retail space. The good thing is with a tenant, you are going to see some rental income, which offsets those costs. And depending on the terms of the lease, the tenant may have some responsibility for those costs. So that is a good thing. Typically, if there's a tenant, there's some income, there's some cost sharing. And that's why tenancy is so attractive with commercial real estate versus residential. Finally, you see debt. I put on the slide, sometimes you see debt with commercial real estate. I should have put often. Debt is frequently part of the mix here, and it depends again on the type of real estate we're talking about. With retail space, maybe you see debt. With something like a hotel, hotels almost always have significant leverage. Same with large spaces like a large mixed-use tower, multi-story tower. You're likely going to see debt in the picture there. So that's something that you really have to be aware of because it comes up often. With that whipped through very quickly, I'll give it over to Gary to talk about trends.
Thanks, Ryan. As everybody probably knows at this point, commercial real estate is highly responsive to macroeconomic conditions. The old phrase that interest rates go up and therefore prices go down applies much more to commercial real estate than even more to commercial real estate than it does to residential real estate. We know that mortgage rates affect sales of residential real estate. Interest rates are even more affected, all right, when it comes to commercial real estate, because basically the people who buy commercial real estate, when there's a donation, are looking at cap rates, and those cap rates are dictated by the interest rates in the market. Okay. Besides interest rates, all right, we also have to look at what's trending in the market. Just recently, we were approached with regard to a piece of property that was in the quote-unquote Silicon Valley of the Northeast, and after doing our due diligence, we came to the conclusion that, in fact, the amount of space that had been created to satisfy the demand for this Silicon Valley type of work they had overbuilt, and so if we took this property, we'd be holding it for a very long time because the market there was much more supply than there was demand. We also had the same situation with another piece of property that we did take. All right, at the time that we took it, the requirements for industrial space in that area in California was great. I mean, the supply was not there. The demand was there, but by the time we worked out an environmental problem on that site, all right, the market had shifted. So you'll see the market can shift very quickly, all right, because once developers get involved, all right, and realize that there's a demand, they build like crazy, and then we end up with these cycles of demand and supply, and they don't always match. Today, we're getting offered a lot of strip centers, right? Why? Because some of the strip centers are not as good as they were because of the internet, and also because of the fact that a lot of small tenants went into bankruptcy or left shopping centers because of COVID. All right, and so consequently, there is not as much demand for the small retail space as there once was. Right, we were in fact offered a small shopping center in South Carolina, and having done our due diligence, we came to the conclusion with the help of the broker that we worked with, that there was another shopping center being built just a couple of miles down the road with a big Walmart in it and more space, so that the chances of us selling this property, all right, at the level that the donor was looking for was highly suspect. Right? So, and today, all right, because of COVID, office space requirements are way down, and that's not just a situation in the United States. Right? I was in China more than 10 years ago, and I was looking at see-through buildings as I was taking the boat down the Yangtze River, all right? And they have a lot of space available, and in the United States, there's a lot of office space available. So taking a gift of an office building that now has a lot of vacancies may not necessarily be the best situation, especially if the donor's expectations do not match the market, and that unfortunately sometimes happens. Okay. Now, moving on now to carrying costs. Okay. Sometimes it's fairly easy to predict what the amounts are going to come in monthly or quarterly or annually, but sometimes it's not so easy. Sometimes you have tenants that are going to be, they're going to be there for long periods of time. What money's going to come in. But recently, Ryan and I handled, all right, a gift of a vineyard. Well, we got a lot of good information from the guy who was leasing the vineyard before it was donated to us. But we didn't know how the crop was going to come out the year that we took it over. Even though we had some idea of what the costs were to operate this vineyard, it turned out to be much greater than we expected. So it's sometimes really difficult to estimate not only the income in, but the cost of maintaining, and that's because the expertise you need to run unique properties, all right, is even greater than the ones that the amount of information and knowledge you need to run what Ryan and I would consider the run-of-the-mill commercial property. And to be very honest, no commercial property is really not run-of-the-mill. They all have their unique qualities. All right. So sometimes when you're talking to donors about this, and you know that you might need some working capital, you have to make arrangements with them, all right, to provide some working capital besides the actual donation of the property. In other words, they need to have some money to make sure that you don't get caught with less income and more costs, so that you would end up in a deficit position. One of the major costs is insurance. Brian mentioned this at the beginning of his talk. right? Insurance rates across the country and across the world, for that matter, have skyrocketed. It's just hard to determine exactly what they're going to be, and getting that insurance, right? Getting the insurance in the first place can be a daunting task. Ryan mentioned on Tuesday that we like to, if we can, and if the insurance company will allow us to, we'd like sometimes ride the donor's insurance policy and just add ourselves as additional named insured, right? To avoid getting a brand new policy with a brand new cost, with a brand new assessment of what the liabilities are. And then again, there's property taxes, right? Those things, property taxes, you know, it's interesting. Inflation, all right, has an effect on real estate across the board, okay? But property taxes, all right, also rise because of that. The towns, believing that they now have higher values because of the fact that it takes more money to create the building, the retail center, the office building than it did before, all right, now reevaluate everything. And before you know it, the property tax has gone up. And by the way, property taxes could have been very low on a particular piece of property for a long period of time because nobody went back in and evaluated it. Now, when it moves from the donor to the charity, right, the property gets reevaluated. And we know this happens in California all the time, all right? And we always have to make have to put money aside to make sure that we can handle that change in assessment. But it happens even more frequently with commercial properties. And then we've got the matter of utilities. Needless to say, if you look at a building, right, and you examine the leases and you find that the tenants have to pay most of the utilities and that most of the utilities are separately metered, that's a great situation to be in, right? But often they're not. Often the utilities are shared, right? And needless to say, the use that the building is being put to really has a tremendous effect on the cost of those utilities. Water may be a problem, may be a situation in some circumstances, especially in manufacturing areas where a great deal of water is needed to run a particular manufacturing process. All right. There is also the question of having lots of computers running all the time and the electricity costs. And if they're not separately metered, that can cause a narrowing of the income coming in against the cost of the utilities that have to be paid. And I know that Ryan mentioned this before, but property managers are important, right? First of all right, we often the donor has been obtaining a salary or retaining his income from the property that he's been managing, right? And now, if we ask him to manage the property, and it would be a conflict for that person to continue to get a salary while he's managing the property, we have to now go to that person and say, all right, unless you take no consideration, this gift will be compromised because the IRS doesn't allow the donor to receive a salary as a manager, all right, at the same time that he donates the property. So that's a consideration that each donor has to look at separately, right? We had a situation in California that didn't involve a problem with the manager's salary, but did involve a situation that you have to be a qualified manager. So although we might like to manage the property ourselves if we took it in as a gift, all right? If we're not qualified under the local regulations to be a manager, we can't do it, all right? Finally, or not finally, but going into the leases, we talked about leases a little bit before, but we're talking a little bit more about it now. The leases are a funny thing. If you get a building or a retail situation where you have a major tenant, those major tenants, okay, can drive very hard bargains with the developer. Not very often what you're doing is getting a gift from the developer who's held the property for a very long time. He made a deal with a major tenant, either with a supermarket or with a major tenant that's going to occupy an office building. And that person, because they allowed him to finance the project in the first place, all right, got a major good deal, right? They have long-term leases at low rents. Okay, so very recently we took in a large shopping center as a gift. Okay, and one of the tenants, all right, that was there, all right, had a long-term lease with multiple options at very low rents. All right, that made the property very difficult to sell. Very difficult to sell, very difficult to market because of the fact that it was a long-term lease. On another situation, we had an office building, right? Mixed retail office, all right, in Chicago, where the predecessor trustee from which we got the gift in the first place, right, by extending the leases for the tenants, all right, at the same rents, all right, for 5 years, basically sucked out all of the value of the property, all right? So major leases with credit tenants can be good. Major leases with non-credit tenants can also be a detriment to the property, okay? I know that Ryan wants to talk about the multifamily situations and their leases at this point.
Yeah. So as far as these large towers that are, multifamily housing or mixed use with a significant number of apartments, Gary's talking about long-term leases and how those are helpful for commercial real estate in many cases, not all. There's pros and cons, as he said. When we're talking multifamily, those are all short-term leases. And those are really a huge driver of not only the net income, but also the donor's deduction and the price that you're going to get. Nearly everything is driven by occupancy rates when you're talking about multifamily. The good thing is, I think occupancy rates and rent payment rates really that picture is improving post-pandemic. During the pandemic, this became very dicey in terms of eviction moratoriums and just tenant non-payment. That made multifamily really tricky during the pandemic. Now it looks a little bit better, but keep in mind, those are short-term leases. There is nowhere near the reliability that you have with your average commercial lease, which is going to run. I mean, I think the shortest I've ever really seen on a commercial lease is 3 years. Usually they're longer than that. So that's a note on multifamily. I did have a couple other things that I wanted to mention. The discussion about property managers' salaries and fees is really relevant, and we didn't plan it this way, but Brian and I just this morning, like immediately before this presentation, we're talking to a donor's attorney about payment of property management fees. As Gary mentioned, our preference is always to have the donor, assuming that they run the property management company, which is usually the case with commercial real estate, the donor can usually waive the property management fees. That's usually no problem. And that's the easiest way to address it. In this case that Brian and I are working on this morning, the number of properties involved is currently 6, and it looks like it's going to be significantly more soon. It's not economical for the donor to continue to carry the cost of property management in that case. So now we're having to have a discussion about how do we establish what a fair property management fee is, such that if the IRS comes sniffing around, we can show, look, we were not paying the donor above market rates, and the donor was not having an excess economic benefit, which would be a transaction that the IRS would penalize for both the donor and for the charity. So that's something to keep in mind in terms of property management. You often have the potential for that related party transaction, and you want to be careful about any payment at all, ideally. And as Gary mentioned, our preference is to have none. The other thing I wanted to mention, I just thought of this as Gary was going through the slide. If you are in a position where you have a vacant piece of commercial real estate, usually that's a single tenant building, you are going to be looking at an additional cost, which is not on here, which is security. You're either going to need a security service in terms of, alarms, or you are going to need an actual security patrol. I have run into that a couple of times. You wouldn't think that you would need to do it. It doesn't come to mind. But if you don't have it, you are going to have squatters. You're going to have people breaking in. You're going to have people stealing copper. That is a reality. And I've gotten those phone calls, and they are not fun calls to get. So vacant commercial real estate, you're going to be looking at some security costs as well.
Let me just add one thing, Ryan, on the question of the multi-tenant situations. Some of these residential buildings that were built originally, okay, because utilities were very low, okay, gas was low, electricity was low. The developer never separately meted the tenants, each of the tenancies, and so therefore, right, the older the building, and the less the developer, and which is usually the situation, and the less the developer or owner separately meted things, the more of an impact that the utilities have on the bottom line, and that's why you have to be very careful, because those costs are creeping up. All right, and income may not be rising as fast. So let's go to environmental risk. Okay. So unfortunately, over the years, I've had a lot of experience in this area, and I can tell you that state laws vary from place to place. Although there are federal regulations concerning certain types of environmental risks and environmental pollution, right? State laws trump all that when it comes to what the donor can do with regard to the property. So, I think I mentioned earlier in my talk about a situation that we had in LA, right? We got this warehouse office mixed use space, right? And it was as I said, there was great demand for the space. Everything was great, but then we did the phase 1 and the phase 2. We realized that there was contamination from groundwater underneath the building that was filtering up through the foundation and causing the air in the space above the plume of water running underneath that space to pollute the air in a way that would not allow people to occupy the space. So we had to go through work with an engineer, work with environmental people to solve the problem, which we did solve. Okay, but it took time, it took money, and as I indicated, during that period of time, right, the environment, the demand for that type of space changed. Now there was an oversupply and an under demand. So that's part of the problem. Okay, but in all these commercial properties, you at least have to have a phase 1. You can't really know what the history of the property is without. And here we have Ryan mentioned on Tuesday, dental offices. We found mercury being disposed of behind the property in a dentist office. All right. Unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember the mercury fillings. All right. And so that is in fact an environmental risk that nobody anticipated. All right. So a phase one, at least a phase one is absolutely required. And then you may have to make a decision based upon the use of the space, whether a phase two is happening. But it's needless to say, it's a big risk. Oil and gas today, with all due respect to how we felt about it in the 1970s when we had discussions about, oh my God, what happens if we receive a gas station as a gift? All right, we wouldn't be able to handle it. But today, oil and gas is not as big a problem. There are lots of techniques, lots of people who clean it up, and it's easy. But the groundwater contamination, you might do everything necessary. And I've experienced this. You might do everything necessary to try and meet the requirements of the state, but if the state requirements are so low, right, that you can't meet them, you are basically, all right, basically in a situation where the impact on the property is basically forever because you can't clean it up. Can never quite reach those levels. So these are real risks that have to be factored in, and I think that basically, as I say, it's a state-to-state situation. Sometimes in some states, when you know where the pollution is coming from, right, then you don't have an effect. There's not going to be an effect on the donor because they know it's being produced by somebody else and they don't have to worry about it. But in most cases, if it does affect your site, then you're responsible for taking care of it. So, Ryan?
Yeah, and I mean to make it even scarier, I guess, the mercury case you mentioned, that's the only time that I know of, and hopefully the only time ever where we've actually gotten sued because of an environmental issue. And this was office space. It happened, it was mercury from a dentist's office, like Gary said. So it was not really something where you would think with a building like that there might be some kind of environmental risk. It turned out there was, and the problem with environmental liability, at least at the federal level, when we're talking about CERCLA law, that's retroactive liability, and it's regardless of fault. That's the way that those Superfund regulations were set up. It creates liability for everyone in the chain of title. That mercury may not have been dumped during our brief period of ownership. We got sued anyways. So, my next bullet point here is about legal risk, and that's a big, scary one for sure. I hope that's the only time it ever happens, but it was a learning experience for me.
Not to interrupt you, Ryan, but the thing is with charities, all right, if you hold it for a very short period of time and then get rid of the property, very often you're the biggest pocketbook on the radar. You are you have the charity has the money. You can say, and as Ryan says, you can say that, well, we're not an insurance company, we're a charity, we shouldn't be liable for this. But the fact of the matter is, if you're in the chain of title, you're responsible.
Yeah. And I mean, that almost makes the other legal risks look minor, but the other ones are things that come up more often, and they're more pedestrian in a lot of ways. Disputes with tenants or neighbors or with the municipality. I don't think I mentioned this on Tuesday, but Brian will remember we had a vacant restaurant in the Carolinas where the municipality was constantly after us to make sure that we were complying with, the local regs, which was difficult to do, and it was costly, and it was a vacant restaurant. Those can be hard to fill. Those can be hard to get a tenant in. So that kind of legal risk is much more common, for better or worse, than the environmental. side of things. The environmental side of things is scary, and it's really scary if it materializes. But if you're thinking about just legal risk broadly, you're talking about disputes with your tenants and the neighbors and with the municipality. So that, that's what you should kind of frame your thinking as, in my view. Brian, anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, I will quickly, and it's such a great point, because I think generally people, advisors on the call, and certainly gift planners on the call, spend, in my view, a lot of time on the environmental risk. And I think you guys are both doing a really good job saying that's very important, but that's not what we see very much. When we talk about eviction, we're like, oh yeah, you just evict. I'm like, oh, okay, let's follow that bouncing ball. An eviction is a lawsuit. And not a joke, because it's happened to me twice now. The person you're evicting will always be a decorated war veteran. Always. And so now you're evicting. We had one, I think Gary helped with this too, and Ryan definitely did, in upstate New York. And he was very good at knowing exactly when to appeal or dispute the eviction right before winter. And seriously, how long did it take us to get him out of there? He hadn't paid for 2 years.
It took us
3 years?
almost a year and a half.
Year and a
Almost
half.
a year and a half.
So he didn't pay anything prior to that, and he didn't pay during the year and a half. So you can sort of imagine what that place sort of looked like overall when we received it. But let me be very, very clear. This is so important. We named it Decami. I wish I would have said this on purpose. I didn't. But it's worked out so well because nobody can, again, pronounce it, spell it, and nobody graduated from us. That particular property came from what I would call a top 3 worldwide known charity. That if they were going to evict this person, oh my God, PR Newswire, this national charity evicting this person, war decorated veteran that's fallen on hard times. Can you believe the evilness? I mean, you can imagine how that would play out. Now let's go the other side. If the charity doesn't do it, that board has a fiduciary obligation to protect the charitable asset, period. He hadn't paid for like a year, year and a half. What are you supposed to do? And so we see this happen a lot with universities, where they'll take in property, they'll be a tenant, things will get a little bit sideways, like, what do we do? Do we take legal action under recourse that we have under the lease? Or do we just like, well, we don't necessarily want to do that to create all kind of PR and other legal issues? So to this point, we deal a lot more with tenant eviction, dispute issues, lawsuits. We tend to have like roughly 1 or 2 lawsuits going on like all the time. That's where these lawsuits tend to come from. So that's all I'll say there. You better be willing to evict, or don't take it in to begin with. That's sort of the point. It's kind of like a note. When you sell a commercial property, you take back a note, you better be willing to foreclose. If you're not willing to foreclose, don't take the note, because notes work great until they don't. Very similar sort of with tenants.
Yeah, and all of that goes to the final bullet point here, which is marketability of the property. With all of this in mind, and we still have more to discuss, how quickly can your charity sell this property? How quickly can you find a buyer? Is the price going to be a good price? Is it going to be something that's in line with the donor's expectations or with any appraisals that might already be on hand? Because that's really important, and you really need to evaluate that before you take the property, before you're on the chain of title, and before all of these potential problems are now your charity's problem because you own the property. So you really want to evaluate how sellable the property is as part of the due diligence. Talk to a realtor before you accept it. Gary mentioned we've avoided some because we did exactly that, some bad ones because we did exactly that. You need a good realtor. The commissions are often high for commercial real estate, can be as high as 10%. A good realtor is worth 10%, I have to say.
Ryan, we had it both in our vineyard situation, okay, and also in the LA warehouse situation. Without the strong brokers that we had, the deals would never have gotten done. A strong broker, a person who knows the area well and who knows the potential buyers, and who is able to carry out all the work that's necessary to put the buyer and seller together, all right, in a rational way, is so important. strong, you know, retail brokers are dime a dozen. They are. Some are good, some are bad. You usually can get by with a retail broker, even if the retail broker is not so great, you can get the house sold. But with a commercial piece of property, you really need that strength. You really need that knowledge of the market.
Yeah, absolutely. Can't emphasize that more. Couldn't agree more. And that actually kind of dovetails with my next point there, because and part of this is, you know, they can help push through to a closing. They can give you a candid and honest evaluation, and they can help you through the closing process, which is long with commercial real estate. Residential, you're talking about a month normally. With commercial real estate, you will be lucky to have it sold within 6 months of going under contract. These due diligence processes with the buyer, it's rare for them to be shorter than even 120 days. Usually 90, 120 is about as short as you'll ever see. 180 is pretty common. You can be under contract for 6 months. Then there are some extensions. Now you're looking at 9, 12, 18. That can happen easily. And you might even still close at the end of that. That's why you need the good realtor to manage that, make sure everything is moving along, make sure any bumps in the road are handled. Because if you end up tying it up under contract and that first buyer terminates the contract for whatever reason, you are going to be in a tough spot where you are looking for a backup buyer. And that is, in my experience, likely going to be at a significantly reduced price. Plus, you've had it off the market for so long because it was tied up under contract.
And remember, everybody, all right, with commercial property, the contracting period of time, all right, the contracting period of time is much more complex, all right. I know that there are lots of state laws and the contracts sometimes in California, for example, are very long, but the actual negotiation of the terms of the contract in commercial properties takes a much longer period of time, and they're much more complex.
Yeah, great point. You'll often sign an LOI with commercial real estate before signing a contract. You never do that with residential. Let's see what we have next here. Income. Yep.
So we covered a little bit of this. We already talked about a little bit about income, covering costs, okay, and trying to get a reserve, right, available, right, so that you have some working capital in case you have a vacancy, in case you need to cover your costs in shopping centers, especially whether they be strip or bigger, right? You have ongoing costs, common area costs that have to be covered, right? And when you have no tenant to cover them, right, then you need to have a cushion, and that's why you may need to go back to the donor and say, you have to make a cash contribution along with the property contribution in order to put us in a position that we have enough working capital to handle contingencies. Right?
Yeah, and I think understanding and balancing the income needs is paramount, first of all. But it's more than just having an understanding there, because there's also practical aspects to it, as in who actually has access to the bank accounts. The rental payments are being deposited somewhere into whose bank account? Property manager's account, your charity's account. You have to figure that out. You have to understand, who is going to be accessing the bank account and paying from that bank account. That really does need to be determined ahead of time, even though it seems like a minor item and seems like it's easy to figure out, and it may be, but you need to know. In our experience, usually if you've got a property manager, have them handle the bank account. Absolutely have them send you statements every month or once a quarter, at worst. But you want the property manager to make sure that the collection of rent and all the expenses are being paid out of that bank account if the property manager is able to do it. And they should be able to do it, because that's what they're doing for their other clients with the other properties that they manage. So that's usually a good way to go. And that kind of goes to staff time as well, because property manager is going to need a contact at your charity. The realtor is going to need a contact. What I would boil this down to is that if you're going to accept commercial real estate, you really do need a dedicated point person at your charity to interface with all the different team members, both internally and externally, and be copied on every single email that's flying back and forth, because there will probably be hundreds. So, you need someone who sees all the communications, knows the history of the donation from beginning to end, so they can answer any questions that your internal finance, accounting, legal team might have, that the donor might have, and they can help the realtor and the property management team collaborate and move towards a successful closing. Really important to have a dedicated person kind of assigned to the property on your team. Final item. This was a last-minute add on the slide deck. You also have to understand how ownership is represented with the commercial real estate. Very rare for a donor to personally own a shopping center or personally own a warehouse. Usually, donors will use an LLC. Perhaps it's owned in a partnership. And even if that's not the case, you as the charity want to consider using an LLC. And then you also will need to understand if there are co-owners on the property. That can greatly complicate the sale process, and that can also complicate management and the rental income, because it's now being split up. You're not getting as much net income perhaps as you might have expected. As a quick example, because we don't have a lot of time left, we did a donation of some retail space in Southern California. None of these other issues that we've talked about came up. It was clean in every other regard, except for one thing. There were 14 other co-owners. This was a 15-seller closing. It was very complicated for that reason alone, just to work through the closing, even though all the co-owners agreed on the sale price, which is not a given, and Gary will tell you is often one of his biggest concerns when we're dealing with a co-owner. Everyone agreed on everything. It was just a nightmare to manage the closing because there were 15 sellers. So let's see, we've got a couple more slides here. Note on debt. This is a quick one as well. As I mentioned early on, debt very common with commercial real estate. We did a webinar 2 months ago, myself and Russ Willis, about donations with debt. All of the issues discussed during that webinar do apply to debt encumbered commercial real estate. Donors really need to understand that, because that can impact their tax picture as well. And in addition, it's going to impact you as the charity potentially in terms of unrelated debt financed income, and of course, servicing the debt. Big issue if you've got a loan that needs to be paid while you, the charity, are the owner. So that's all I'll say about the debt. And then finally, we've got a couple minutes to discuss planned giving options. So with all of this in mind, what are the charitable options? Outsourcing to a donor advised fund. The reason we have so much experience with this in large part is because we are running a donor advised fund that will accept commercial real estate. Your charity may not want to take on these risks, this headache, the staff time, itself. You could refer to a donor advised fund. First, you're going to have to find one that's willing to accept the property, because the DAF is going to have all of the same issues that your charity would have. So that may take some time, but it can be a very effective way to get the donation completed, where you, the charity, end up with a grant from a donor advised fund the same way that you probably do every day anyways. So a donor advised fund can work, assuming you find one that is willing to accept the commercial real estate. Charitable remainder trusts, these can work very well. Gary and I worked on one maybe 2 or 3 years ago, large, valuable apartment building, funded into a charitable remainder trust. Got to have those flip provisions. I think I kept that bullet point word for word from last month's crypto webinar. That's the only area where commercial real estate and cryptocurrency overlap. If you want a charitable remainder trust with either, you really need to have flip provisions. Debt, as discussed on the previous slide, is common, and that's a big issue with charitable remainder trusts. Paul Casperson and Russ Willis had that come up earlier this week. That can really be an issue, because the presence of debt will disqualify the trust. And then finally, if you're considering commercial real estate funding a charitable remainder trust, you have to find trustees who are willing to manage it. That's not a given either. We've worked with big trust companies who will not do commercial real estate into a charitable remainder trust, even though they have enormous staffs and a lot of expertise otherwise.
And that's one of the helpful things about Decamide, because Decamide Foundation Inc. will do what other corporate trusts will not do, and act as a trustee in that regard. Finally, I want to talk about CGAs just for a moment, okay? Brian didn't mention when he talked about CGAs and talked about the National Gift Annuity Foundation, but we're one of the only entities that does CGAs that are funded with real estate, and they're funded with both residential and commercial properties, right? And we do that, and we're doing a lot of them these days, because as much as the price of the properties have gone up in value, the rents have not kept up. So somebody receiving $3,000 worth of rent on $1 million per month and $36,000 a year on $1 million property, who's 75 years old, all right, is not getting as good a return as he will in a CGA at 5.1 or 5.2 or 5.3%, and the person will have a lot less headaches. So we're doing a lot of those, and I think it's something that we've seen an explosion of in the last 2 years. And finally, I want to say something about testamentary, because I did mention it before, and that is the oil and gas situation. All right, when you get a testamentary gift, right, or you get a gift, we have been handling, all right, situations with commercial real estate that the executors and trustees of estates don't want to handle. So we've been handling them, and we've been able to take over all the obligations and basically protect the executors and trustees from any further expense of operating the commercial and residential real estate.
Exactly. Well, thank you guys. I think that was the last slide, right? Yeah, Q&A. Maybe one more. So a great question came up during the Q&A about the past debt ones. And so you can see their March debt, the 4-letter word of non-cash transaction. So that'd be one that came up, as I said, in the Q&A. This only goes through 2022. As you see, we've started these sort of right when COVID started to be able to get some information and content out. So it does not have the other couple of years, but all of these are free. All of them are on the platform. The new YouTube one within Charitable Solutions, LLC.com, resources, webinars. But Gary, Ryan, thank you so much. This was incredibly good. And I think we would all agree too that this actually may have covered 50%, maybe a little bit more, of all of the issues. And as Gary said very correctly, if you've done one of these, you've done one of these. So however expert you think you are after doing one, you will be taught many lessons, and we have many virtual scars ourselves going through these where everyone has a different head to the Hydra, interestingly, but also sometimes in a bad way. But still, a lot of wealth captured here, a lot of donors wanting to make contributions, and these are the assets that they have. So great job overall, and thank everybody for your time, and good luck.